Hello, everybody, and welcome back to the channel. If you do keep up with my channel extensively, I'm sure you would know that your boy right here is a determinist. So I've made two videos explaining why I can see a determinist perspective. I think the first one is literally just called Why I'm a Determinist. I kind of just like went all over the place in that one. Well, to be fair, I go all over the place in my videos as well because, by the way, if it isn't obvious, none of these videos are actually scripted. I'm legitimately just talking, off the top of my head. But anyway, another video I made was explaining logical determinism. So if you haven't seen that, definitely go ahead and check it out. But for this video, I didn't necessarily want to advocate for a specific kind of determinism. I was just fixated on the question, which is the title of this video, what is the nature of free will? And after, contemplating it further, I did want to share some thoughts that I would think perhaps could better convince people into considering the determinist perspective, because I know that a lot of people are very, set on believing in free will. To a lot of people, the idea of being a determinist is really uncomfortable because they feel as though they're, restricted or have some sort of like restraint. But I guess if you ask me, it is kind of stupid to think that because if we already know, if you can buy my position that everything in the world, the universe is determined and there is no such thing as any actual free will, then how you can exist within having no free will is never the issue because without the lack of free will, which is what I'm saying is, the structure of the universe in which how we live it, I would argue that you can't even exist if there is such a thing as free will. So that's essentially why I'm positing the question, because I guess for a lot of people that do believe in free will, I do want to challenge that. Well, naturally, yeah, obviously I would because I'm a determinist, basically. But I was thinking about, just that question alone, what is the nature of free will? And it, you know, it just like came to me that isn't that quite an oxymoronic question, a very contradictory, sort of question? Because if you do believe in free will, I do want you to consider why it is that you believe in free will and how exactly you explain free will and what exactly, quote unquote, is like the nature of free will. But honestly, if you ask me, I think the moment you do that, you've already stepped into a trap because the understanding of freedom is basically having no restraints, right? And the uncomfortable feeling that a lot of people have towards determinism is essentially feeling some kind of restraint. But if you ask the question of what something's nature is, i.e., in this case, what is the nature of free will, you're already structuring how something works. And if something has a structure, I would argue that it is something that's already determined. So basically, to even attempt to, answer this question, if you ask me from like my point of view, what is the nature of free will? How do you explain free will? How does free will work? That doesn't make any sense. And that's why I'm saying that the idea of determinism shouldn't be uncomfortable because I'm saying that if you didn't have any preset conditions, if you didn't work under any form of, mechanical blah, 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 or whatever, or I say mechanical in the sense of like you didn't have gears, so to speak, biologically, let's say, if we didn't have, the nature of something that put the code in, so to speak, no different in the way that if a computer didn't have any code, it wouldn't be able to, function as it does, then you simply wouldn't be. Because the idea of freedom actually just does not make sense at all. And the only reason we have a feeling of freedom is because we have an illusion of freedom. I should perhaps make a video on why compatibilism doesn't really make sense to me, and I'll expand even further when I tell a lot of people that, okay, sure, I don't deny that we definitely feel like we have free will. So I think when it comes to a lot of like compatibilists, they know there isn't any free will, but they're trying to have their cake and like, eat it too. So perhaps like in a future video, I will further expand upon why I don't really think the compatibilist perspective, makes any sense to me. But like, yeah, to wrap it all up, there's no way to approach explaining free will, if you ask me. because that's already a self-sabotaging question. Which is why also I, have a hard time believing in God because, like a typical non-religious person, there's been talk for so long about how you can quote unquote be free, and yet there's supposedly, an omniscient, God, because I do hold to the notion that an omniscient being and the free will of all other agents apart from that being can coincide together, because it's something like this. Like a quick, maybe I have to make that its own separate video, but like a quick rundown is basically, how can somebody know knowledge about a quote unquote like free being, so to speak, if God is omniscient and he's all knowing? He already sees everything before they're even, done being completed, right? Because that would basically be, having, you know, yeah, omniscience basically, like, yeah, like having like, infinite knowledge. But this is actually very contradictory, which is why I think I hold to the notion of, logical determinism, in which something in the future is either this or that. It cannot be anything else. Or even if it's a variable that's like out of our control, that's kind of like what I'm saying again, that's a variable that would be out of our control. So therefore, either everything is determined and essentially we have no free will because of that, or everything is random, and by that logic, we still have no free will because there are things that we have, basically no say in. And we don't have any say in anything because it just goes back, if you ask me, to the whole like, okay, you can do whatever you want, but you can't want whatever you want. So I would honestly argue, and this is basically the same thing that I'm going to basically keep repeating in this video over and over again, is that if you attempt to participate in this conversation towards free will and determinism, you are attempting to explain the layout in which human beings are able to function within the environment, within themselves. And I remember having a conversation actually with somebody, and I hold to the notion that both nature and nurture are, the reasons in which we have no free will. So, okay, yeah, this reminds me of like, yeah, one conversation that I was particularly having with somebody. Somebody asked me because, they were questioning my determinist, point of view as to whether or not I believe in, recovery. Like, let's say when people go to, I don't know, rehab to like seek treatment or something. Honestly, I believe that whether or not somebody can be fixed in a rehab facility or not, it's, yeah, basically like everything else, it is still something that is, not, within their control. So basically, I don't really think it matters so much when people ask the question, okay, is it nature or nurture? At least in the context in terms of like, okay, like what determines free will? Because, yeah, kind of like what I said, I'm saying that there is no free will between nature or nurture. Perhaps it's still another separate sort of like meta conversation in a way, in, trying to see whether or not people are mostly influenced by their environment or mostly influenced by like their biology. But I don't think that has anything to do with whether or not we lack free will or not. I still believe that we lack free will, basically. Or I don't know, maybe I have to think about that like a little more. But, basically, okay, this is what I want to point out though. If somebody is in a rehab facility and they're being treated, for their addiction, basically, it's going to go one or two ways. Either it helps them or it doesn't help them. And let's say like worst case scenario, they end up overdosing because of their addiction, and they end up dying essentially. But if they do get help, then I see it. I see both the person that couldn't recover and the person that could recover and, quote unquote like stay sober. They still had elements that were beyond their control that determined the fate in which the outcomes that they, separately experience, you know happened in that way. So basically, if somebody cannot, let's say, recover from their addiction, that's because, obviously you can look at like the neuroscience and stuff, or like whatever, like addiction is, like, you know it does something to, your brain, right? And not everybody reacts like in the same way. So certain people will definitely fall into the pit of addiction like harder than other people. It just depends on like again, yeah, like, all these factors. Like let's say like that person's like biological, sort of like structure. So despite getting the external help, if somebody's, like biology is so deeply rooted into that addiction, then sure, that is not something that they can control. And I know somebody listening might already be like, oh, well, it was their choice to like, like take the drugs. Like, again, this is just a small bit of like the overall like determinist, like, conversation. So if you're, considering that and just like toss it aside for like a little bit, like I'm trying to make my point in the sense that like, okay, so basically how that person operates prevented them from allowing the external help, the rehab facility, the doctors, whatever, into getting out of it. So therefore they were still stuck within their restraints. Now if the other person who's able to make a recovery thanks to the help of like the doctors or like whatever, how is it that I wouldn't be able to argue that if they didn't get that help they would still be the same as that person that couldn't be helped despite getting help? Because basically that's why people go to rehab, right? They have trained professionals, they have trained doctors, I imagine, to like, help people get out of like addiction. They have addiction specialists, whatever, all that kind of stuff. So if they couldn't have done that on their own without the help of basically like a rehab facility, then it's because of nature that they were only able to change. They had to be, manipulated, twisted, like no different than like a machine, honestly. They had to be like poked and prod, fixed up. They had to get the tools, so to speak, and that's how they are able to manage and recover and quote unquote like be sober. Now, if something cannot be fixed, whether it's a person or a machine, then that's because it's built in a way in which it is stubborn to be that way. So therefore, no external influence could help um, let's say that innate like like structure of something that an external thing is trying to help, and the innate structure of something that can be helped could only have changed because of the external influence. So whether you look at it internally or externally, you will not have free will because everything is always cemented in the conditions in which it operates. So that's why, yeah, that's why I do think it's irrelevant, honestly, in terms of the whole like nature versus like nurture thing. So to wrap this whole video up, what is the nature of free will? It's a question that doesn't make any sense. It's a question that, basically you're not even saying anything at all. It's oxymoronic if you ask me honestly, the nature of free will, the nature of free will.